without moving the camera, am I on the screen here?
Yes.
And am I on the screen here?
Yes.
Then I can move around. All right, so we are going to move on. Go ahead. We are going to move on with our next thing about the Korean War. So a quick, are you recording now?
Yeah.
All right. A quick timeline is that in 1945, the United States develops and deploys 3 nuclear weapons. These nuclear weapons are traditional atomic bombs. They work by splitting atoms apart. That releases an awful lot of energy. But during the Korean War, at some point in the 1949, right before the Korean War, America develops the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb works by shoving atoms together to make a new atom. And that releases even more energy. The development of hydrogen bombs is going to be a quantitative leap forward in destructive power and an existential threat to the world. That we are talking about existential threats to the world today.
We love that.
We are in the early bird class at the moment for this video. And so after World War II, Russia and the Soviet Union are going to divide the Korean Peninsula into 2 zones of influence. These spheres of influence are characterized in the same way that other spheres of influence are developed around the world. America sometimes buys their way in, as we did with Greece and Turkey, for $400 million, and then we put missiles and military bases there. And the Soviet Union does much the same, except without money, more like an Occupy plan. So Western Europe has become divided, the Korean Peninsula has become divided, and the world has become divided. Dean Acheson, as you know, said that the world has only 2 great superpowers, and you either belong with them or you belong with us. Oh, there's Dean Acheson. He had a speech at the National Press Club to define our sphere of influence. For those of you watching at home, you can follow along on the notes on Edmodo. If you are a guest watching this, you can look this up for yourself, I suppose. But Dean Acheson gave a speech to the National Press Club in January of 1950. And he outlined the United States sphere of influence in the world. Unfortunately, he did not list South Korea as being in that sphere of influence, which was strange because we had previously stated that it was. And the Soviet Union took this as a clear indication that we didn't want it, that it was beyond our interest. And so the Soviet Union immediately, beginning in January of 1950, immediately armed the North Korean military under Kim-Jung-Un. And in July of 1950, that North Korean army invades south across the 39th parallel. Because the Soviet Union believed that we had given it to them, basically, and theirs was a plan of occupation to gain spheres of influence. Whereas America often started with money and diplomacy. Go ahead. So if you're on the next slide and you can see the map, the North Koreans invade across the 39th parallel south, and eventually the South Korean and United States forces are pushed into a small pocket of resistance at the southern end of the peninsula. This portion of the peninsula was known as the Pusan Perimeter. The American troops and the South Korean troops were largely unprepared for this attack. I mean, we didn't know it was going to happen, although the North Koreans and the Soviet Union said, you kind of said we could have it. I mean, there's no real diplomacy. Be aware that in the video we watched last week, you got to see all the nuclear detonations in human history. And that was largely diplomacy. That's how the United States and the Soviet Union spoke to one another during the Cold War. We didn't actually have a phone we could pick up and call the Kremlin during much of this period because we weren't going to be talking to communists. They might say communist things.
What?
Go ahead. There's Douglas MacArthur. If you read his autobiography, American Caesar, as I did, you would think him arrogant as well. Douglas MacArthur had been the military dictator of Japan. He was the one who accepted the Japanese surrender on the battleship Missouri. He was the one who rewrote the Japanese Constitution. Go ahead. And he was selected to lead the United States Armed Forces in Korea. So one of the challenges that America has during this time is that the United Nations is supposed to guide diplomacy. This is a let's have a conversation, not a fight club. And so the United States wants to have a conversation about defending South Korea. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union, Russia specifically, has a United Nations Security Council permanent seat. And when they are in the room, they're not going to allow any resolution about the defense of South Korea. And so at one point, the American diplomat in the room insults the Russian diplomat, and he storms off in a huff. And we quickly pass a resolution. Now, I imagine it turned out badly for that Russian diplomat because he had one job. He had only one job, and it's to stop a vote on any resolution defending South Korea. But when he was out of the room, the United Nations did just that. And so now the war becomes not one of the conflicts that America votes on. We actually do not vote to go to war. We enter this conflict under the auspices of the United Nations. This is a Security Council action. There's Douglas MacArthur. He claimed that he understood, and I'm quoting his autobiography, he claimed that he understood the Oriental mind. Okay, we'll move on. So using Soviet weapons, the North Koreans invade South Korea, pushing American troops into the Pusan Perimeter, and it's going to take some time for the United Nations forces to get organized and resupply the peninsula. Go ahead. Oh, no, stay here. So while we're on this video today, in the future I'll be referencing the notes that you can access through Edmodo, but you can see here that from the Pusan Perimeter, Douglas MacArthur's plan, known as the Incheon Landing, is to put troops on boats and go around here to Incheon and then cut across the peninsula, cutting off North Korean supplies in South Korea. Go ahead. And that's exactly what we do. It's the largest amphibious landing to date, and it works brilliantly. It does cut off North Korean supply lines, and soon the North Koreans are in full retreat to the north. Yeah, so it says it works. But what's north? Go back a slide. Another. You'll notice that north of North Korea, we find China. In fact, the province of Manchuria, which had been brutalized by Japanese forces in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1931 and the Second Sino-Japanese War of 1937 and all of World War II. Manchuria is understandably nervous about invasions in the same way that the Soviet Union is. So when the American forces approach the Yalu River, which is the boundary of North Korea and China, the Chinese get nervous. Go ahead. Again, yeah. Yes. So although the North Korean army is in retreat, MacArthur wanted to pursue them all the way to the Chinese border. China was understandably not thrilled about this. Having an American army on the Chinese border was problematic for any communist nation, of course, because America doesn't like communism. So the communist Chinese get very nervous about this, and they place an awful lot of troops on that border because they felt threatened. So soon, Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River. Initially up to 600,000 Chinese troops came across the North Korean border into North Korea, and one of the greatest defenses by the United States Marines in our history happened at Chosin Reservoir. I'm going to recommend a book. If I can think of the name of it, I loaned my copy out. Find any book about the Chosin Reservoir. It's one of the greatest moments in U.S. Marine history. They saved the Army, and the Army was our U.S. Army was unprepared for 600,000 Chinese coming over the horizon. But the Marines showed up and saved the day. It was a brutal event. I will warn you that modern books about the Chosin Reservoir defense against the Chinese invasion of North Korea contain pictures, and many people in the pictures do not survive the Chosin Reservoir. So it's like watching one of those TV shows on Netflix where your favorite character may die. that's likely to happen in any narrative about the Chosin Reservoir. Go ahead. Again? So, President Truman, who is still president at this time, is going to fear any large-scale U.S. involvement in a war in Asia, because the problem is that there's an awful lot of people that can be drawn into this. So Douglas MacArthur, the guy in charge of the U.S. military and the UN forces in the Korean Peninsula, says that he wants access to battlefield nuclear weapons. And he says it in a way that indicates that he actually wants to use them. Douglas MacArthur actively seeks to gain access. Yeah? What?
When they conquer Red Alert time.
Well, Douglas MacArthur presents a challenge to the world because he is intent on using nuclear weapons in a conflict. And President Truman is the only human being who authorized the use of nuclear weapons ever, and I'm sure it haunted him. And so Truman did not want MacArthur to use nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, he summons MacArthur to the White House. Do you remember Julius Caesar?
Oh.
When the triumvirate, when two of the three of the triumvirate fired Julius Caesar, who's the third of the triumvirate, you know that Julius Caesar brings his army to Rome, he crosses the Rubicon, he takes over the government. Now, it is a crime punishable by death because he makes himself dictator for life, but the reality is that you probably shouldn't have fired a general when he was with his army. And President Truman has read a book or two, and he is not going to fire Douglas MacArthur when Douglas MacArthur is with his army. So he summons him to Washington, D.C. first, so that MacArthur cannot make battlefield decisions before he is removed from his position. And the reason he's removed is because of his public desire, like newspaper interviewed desire to use nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula. MacArthur was escalating the conflict, not in a very diplomatic manner, whereas Truman wanted to tone it down a bit. So the war settles down into a stalemate that eventually achieves a ceasefire. You and I live in a world where there has been no treaty ending the Korean War. We are not yet there. There was talk last year that we were about to sign a treaty. I am hopeful. Let's see if it happens. But at the moment, we live with the reality of hostility on the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea, and between North Korea and the United States. 55,000 dead, 113,000 were wounded. And the United States citizens wondered if the U.S. government was actually interested in stopping communism, because this is a war, for once, that we didn't win. Has there been a war yet in U.S. history up to 1950?
Really lose it,
we didn't win. We got back to the 39th parallel. The Korean Peninsula was, is, will be a divided peninsula. And that we didn't end communism in North Korea.
Is this just American casualties, or is this total
This is
casualties?
American casualties,
Oh.
that's correct.
Excellent.
So thank you for watching this first video today. Thank you, audience.